Good morning, sunshines. Welcome back. If you're still here, I hope. Again, hopefully you've sent me your favorite actor and are well on the way to producing your paper for that. You got a little time, but no time like the present. What we're going to talk about today is just a little lead in to get things started. First of all, just what is theater? Theater is the term theater is a Greek word that means man in action. And so obviously you've got plays in which people do things. So that's where theater gets its name from. Every culture has had some sort of theatrical presentation. Really, one of the major things you need in society is a group of people or a group of society that is strong enough to have people that don't have to raise food. An army strong enough to protect the environment. Even those that don't have those qualities still will sit around a campfire and sing songs and do dances. I'm sure that there are videos all over the internet right now where people are going stir crazy in their homes, singing songs and doing dances. And so it's all very theatrical, even in that environment. But to have public displays, one of the major things, well, first of all, let's talk about the 5 basic elements of theater. There are 5 things you have to have in order to have what I'm going to call theater. The first one is an actor. All those videos that we just talked about have actors. They all happen in a space. The space affects the actors. If you're in a huge auditorium that seats 50,000 people and you are by yourself without a microphone, you're not going to win many souls. And if you're comfortable in your home, you've got air conditioning working and stuff like that, life's much easier. So the environment has an effect on the performer. Yes. The third thing that most of these videos don't have, at least in the presentation or the filming of the video, is this thing called an audience. In theater, the thing that makes theater different from film or movies or anything else, or television, is that in theater the audience is live. And at its core, theater is a form of communication. There's usually some sort of fourth thing, message. There's some sort of reason, a message to be sent. And for those of you who are communication majors, you know this. When you send a message, there's the message you think you're sending, and then the audience is there to receive it, and they, for reasons unbeknownst to you, it could be that they have different life experiences, it could be that they're not fully attentive to you, it could be that you have a slur in your voice, or say things just wrong, or somebody coughs at just the wrong moment, and they didn't exactly hear the key word to the sentence. They interpret what you're saying, and it may be exactly what you said, or it could be different from what you said. And then they will usually send you a response, again, because it's a live audience, they'll laugh, or they'll cry, or they'll squirm in their seat, or whatever. And as an actor, you are receiving that message back. So that's what it is a perfect form of communication. Again, the audience, if we just have an actor in a space, it's what we call a rehearsal. If you have an actor, an audience, and a space, I'm gonna say that's a happening. Those 3 things in and of themselves can be theater, but it's rare that you have that happen. The only happening I've ever been to in Montgomery, Alabama, was when the first Star Wars, which is now Star Wars 4 for some reason, was reintroduced in 1999, maybe. There were several scenes that were added back to it, like Jabba the Hutt talking to Han Solo, that were edited in from the original that was back in '75. And so everyone showed up to the movie, the midnight showing, and we were all sort of dressed as different characters. We were dressed as Yoda, we were dressed as Obi-Wan Kenobi, Luke Skywalker. We were just all standing around in costume and had lightsabers, and occasionally we'd break out and do a scene and have a lightsaber battle. And we were just people acting, audience watching, space happening. There was no purpose, no plan behind it. Yes? So that's what I mean by happening. If you're in Los Angeles or San Francisco or New York, a lot of those places have theater companies that specialize in happenings. I'm sure you've seen videos of this where you'll have actors that are just sitting around a restaurant and suddenly they'll all start singing Grease or something. And there'll be some poor sot who wasn't in on the gag. And of course, then you're sitting there watching them react to this group of people all singing Grease Lightning or whatever. So that's a happening, yes? Now, typically those 3 things, along with the purpose, which again, one of the reasons we do theater at AUM is not only to entertain, that would be wonderful. We'd like to have a full house and make some money, But that's not why we do it. The reason we do theater at AUM is to train our actors, to train our designers, to train our stage managers, to train our audience. A lot of our students, when they're in a show, they'll say, why do the audience show up at 7:35? The show starts at 7:30. Well, the reason is, if you go to see a movie, remember when we used to be able to go see movies? When you go see a movie and it said the movie started at 7:30, if you were lucky if it started by 8 o'clock, 8:10, because you had all these previews. And so that trains an audience for movies that you can show up 30 minutes late and still see the entire movie. In theater, if it says the play starts at 7:30, the play starts at 7:30. If you show up at 7:35, you're late. And it's amazing the amount of information in 5 minutes one can receive as an audience that tells you what's going on in the play. And if you miss that information, you oftentimes aren't able to catch up to figure out what in the world is going on, who's who, how they're related, all that sort of stuff. So one of the first lessons I'm going to teach you, again, we're not going to actually go to see a play, but I'm going to show you some, send you some videos. But one of the first things to know about theater is it tends to start on time. One of the first things we're going to do for you is the last play we read is a play called Angels in America. It was written by a man named Tony Kushner. Tony Kushner won the Pulitzer Prize for it. He's an award-winning author, a playwright, as well as a screenwriter. He won an Oscar for Lincoln. We'll talk more about him in a couple weeks when we talk about Tony Kushner. But here's a little video about Tony Kushner talking about what theater is to him.
There's a great power in the inability of theater to create a complete illusion. And I think that live performance obviously has a certain kind of excitement that digitally reproduced or electronically delivered media doesn't have. There's a difference between watching a live actor on stage and an actor in a film, because what you do while you're in the audience watching can and will actually impact the performance and alter it. That's not an experience that you can have watching a film. And you don't know when you're going into the theater what's going to happen, which produces a kind of discomfort and an anxiety. Theater is not finished. It's not concluded. When it goes away, when a run of a place is gone, it's gone forever. So all of those things are I think, very vivid in one's conscious or unconscious mind when one is watching the theater. I think it's a infinitely more powerful communal experience because of that. You team up with your other audience members, even if you don't know them, to have an impact on the stage. You do that within the first 5 seconds, whether you've intended to do that or not. People who go to the theater all their lives aren't aware that they do it, but anyone who's on stage or who does theater knows that within 5 minutes of the thing beginning, you know what kind of audience you're going to be dealing with. There's a great power in the inability of theater to create a complete illusion. Theater can't really entirely successfully convince you that anything that isn't actually happening on stage is happening. Whether you're talking about a murder or an angel crashing through a ceiling or any number of things, you have all sorts of clever tricks to make people to try and make them actually believe that what they're seeing is happening. And there is a part of the audience experience of watching these illusions on stage that's very compelling, and they believe that what they're seeing on some level is actually happening. So they're moved or exhilarated or terrified or whatever, as they would be if this was happening in the real world. But because the illusion is always in theater only partially successful and not overwhelming, and really can't be just because of a limitation of means, because of the sort of cooling distance, physical distance. So all of these things work to sort of militate against your completely believing that what you're seeing is real. And that creates, I think, a kind of critical consciousness. And I think it's why theater is, one of the reasons that theater is absolutely essential to human beings. What theater does is create a laboratory in which people have a direct experience of being able to believe and disbelieve at the same time, and to watch something and to get what it's supposed to be and what it's made to be on its surface, and also to read it at the same time, sort of dig beneath the surface and interpret. There's a way in which the doubleness of theater, I think, its poverty of means, works in a profoundly important sort of epistemological way, and teaches you something no matter what it is that you're watching, which is that you can't be a literal reader of life. You have to be an interpreter, and unless you do that, you're a mechanical who doesn't get the essential truth and joke of life. There'll always be new forms of theater, and we have a tradition in this country of experimentation with theatrical form that's really produced some of the most magnificent works of theatrical art of the last 50, 60 years. I mean, theater always incorporates sort of cutting-edge technology that it can afford. Back in the days, in the 18th century, it brought in all these pulleys and ropes. Those were the pulleys and ropes being used on ships. Ships were the most advanced technological stuff available. So the idea that you could hoist scenery by means of pulleys and ropes was a new application of physics. And now you can go see the work of somebody like Liz LeCompte in the Wooster Group, and she does stuff with video screens and television that, and it's fantastic and exciting stuff. The forms will change to this or that extent and still be recognizable. We can still look at Aeschylus, which is about as early as a text as we have, and even though it was performed by people who thought that the brain was in the liver and who had a completely different sense of cosmology than we had, so much of it is instantly recognizable, and the basic dramatic form is there. It's really about two opposing points of view, or three opposing, that get on stage and yell at each other until one of them wins or both of them lose or whatever. And part of the experience is always that it's fake and it's not what you experience in your daily life, and it's something cruder and rougher and unconvincing. And that's what theater is for, is to bring you face to face with, I think, a more essential sense of what human beings are, or a more sort of stripped down sense of what human beings are, freed of the trappings of everyday life and the things that we're used to. I don't see how that really alters, and innovation is always important and exciting to any art form, but I don't think it's predictable exactly how that'll go. I'm Tony Kushner, and I'm encouraging all of you to subscribe to Thinker. The content is extraordinary and exciting, and it will actually make you think.
Again, it gets kind of philosophical, but that's okay. Again, it's a form of communication. It's a way to tell stories. But as an audience, we live together. We live and breathe as one thing. And the way theater works is because of this thing called a willing suspension of disbelief. You don't have to sign a contract when you walk in, but for the purposes of the sake of emotional response to the play, as an audience, you have to agree. When I walk on stage and I say I'm Oedipus, there's no way I'm Oedipus. But if I walk on stage and for the purposes of the play I say I'm Oedipus, as an audience, you have to say, okay, I'll believe that Mike Winkelman is Oedipus for this play, and I will watch what happens to him, and when he pokes his eyes out, I will mourn for him, knowing A, that he's not Oedipus, and B, he didn't really poke his eyes out. Yes, because I have to do the play again tomorrow at 7:30 as well. Yes, and so it's called the willing suspension of disbelief. It's the ability to take what happens on stage for real. I'll tell you a little story. Way back when, we did a production called The Real Inspector Hound, and we learned the hard way that you have to put a piece of paper that says that gunshots will be fired during a show on this play. In the play, it's written by Tom Stoppard, and there's a great deal of debate as to who the real Inspector Hound is, a Scotland Yard inspector. And at one point, this guy who's been in a wheelchair the entire show takes off his mask and stands up out of the wheelchair and says, "I am the real Inspector Hound." And another person on stage, an actor on stage, takes a gun out and shoots him. and we had a blood pack in this actor's vest that exploded with blood. It was a cool effect, and he fell down dead on the floor. Well, there was this young lady who was attending the show who had just moved down from New York City and apparently had witnessed 5 murders in her life. And as soon as she stood up and that blood pack went off, she ran screaming from the theater. And the house manager had to catch her and say, no, 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 it was planned, it's part of the play. Well, she did not willingly suspend her disbelief. She thought that man had just been shot in front of her. And so we learned the hard way that if something happens like that, we put a big notice saying there are gunshots in this show, it's part of the performance, yes? And so, again, it's the way that plays work. You have when you laugh with a character, when you go see a movie and you laugh when they laugh, or when they fall in love, you're moved to tears, or whatever it is, it's that emotional response you have to celluloid, to actors on stage who are this close to you in real live theater. Yes, so that's the way theater works. The other thing about theater that is very different from any other form of art, in addition to being a form of communication, as most art forms are, is also an art. If you're a painter, who cares other than you what the painting looks like? Do you want other people to enjoy it? Sure. If they want to buy it for $1 million, great. But ultimately, it's your painting. You don't change it or not change it. For sculpture, yeah, same thing. In theater, we do this thing. We collaborate. We work together. And so you have these actors on stage who are wearing costumes that have been designed by a costume designer, who are walking around on a set that has been designed by a set designer, who are walking into and out of lights that have been designed by a lighting designer, who's been coordinated by this person called a director. When all of those things are in sync, plays tend to work very well. When those things are out of sync, if the actor's not standing in the light correctly, if the costume is ill-fitting or falls off, or there's 100 things could go wrong in any particular performance. When those things happen, the play doesn't work. It's because that collaboration fell short. Yes. Now, as a person who's worked in theater their entire life, I will tell you it's a lot easier to figure out what went wrong with production than it is to find out what went right with the production. If you have worked with someone who you just don't get along with and the whole show is just a pain in the butt, it's often because there's a conflict in energy. But when things all work out right, sometimes it's hard to figure out what exactly went right. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to go right next time, but you hope it does. But again, you are working with other artists to achieve the artistic goal of the final production. Yes, so that's collaboration. First of all, and some of you may be English majors, simile is a comparison using like or as. Metaphor is a direct comparison. So for instance, if you were to go to lunch with me a little bit, you might say, Mike, you eat like a pig. Or you might say, Mike, metaphorically, you are a pig. Yes? Good theater is metaphor. When you see good theater, it's not because the person acted like Oedipus, they were Oedipus. Yes? So when you see bad theater, it's because they usually are a simile. They act like they're upset, they act like they've been shot, they act like they're in love. Whereas good theater, they don't act like it, they are. Yes, they truly are a metaphor for what's going on stage. Yes? So just one quick comparison. Let's talk about dates real quick. I'm going to give you a lot of dates in this class. First of all, dates are ish. I know this is horrible to history majors who love everything to be knocked down, screwed tight as to exactly what dates are. I'm going to agree with the book as best I can. I'm going to use the dates that are in your book just to avoid any confusion. But let me just tell you, there are some dates in your book that I'm going to say are wrong, especially with some of the older playwrights. Aristophanes, I think, particularly is 5 years off. But that's because we found out a lot of information about other things since the book was published 20 years ago. But I'm still going to stick with the dates in the book, just so not to confuse you. Now, on the test, if you give me a complete definition of a person and you don't include their dates, fine. If all you include is their date, that isn't necessarily a full definition, yes? But mostly dates are ish. Now let's talk about BC and BCE and CE and AD. First of all, well, let's talk about the Mayan calendar. There are other calendars out there, the Jewish calendar, for those of you who might be Jewish. I'm not going to make light of this. If you're Jewish, you can tell me what year it is, but I think in the Jewish calendar, it's 4,357. I could be wrong, it may have changed. But that's a date that they use on their Jewish calendar. On the Anglo-European calendar, we date our calendar off the birth of Jesus Christ. Now again, in China, they don't necessarily use that calendar, but they use it for business because America is the leading nation as far as business is concerned, so our calendar wins. So BC obviously means before Christ. There are those historians who don't like the fact that we have dated our calendar on the birth of a son of a carpenter in Bethlehem in around 0. And so they use the term BCE, before the current era. The problem with that is they still use Christ's birth as the date they use to date their stuff. So CE means current era, BCE means before the current era. They're synonymous with BC is BCE, and CE is synonymous with AD. Now, a lot of you think that AD stands for after death. It doesn't. That leaves out 33 years of history because Christ was 33, if you believe that, when he died. So AD means anno, the year of, Domini, our Lord. So AD is the year of our Lord. Yes? Now, let's talk about when BC becomes AD. There's the year before Christ is born. Yes? That's 1 BC. Then Christ is born, December 25th. We'll go with that. January 1st is the first day of the new year because he is christened and he's given his bris and his name on the 8th day of his birth, which is the Jewish tradition. So January 1st becomes the first day of the new year. So you are in the year of our Lord 1. There's never a year 0. There's a moment 0 at his bris, but there's BC, the year before Christ, and there's the first year of Christ. And the end of that first year is his birthday 1. Yes? So those are how dates are used. Now, even those dates, there are a group of Chinese philosophers who noted there was a big star explosion in the sky, who had no inkling of who Christ was. And so the same star in the sky that the 3 kings saw were seen by Chinese philosophers. And if you use the Chinese philosophers' sighting and date those sightings, it tends to cite around 3 or 4 BC. So theoretically, Christ could have been born 3 or 4 years earlier. I'm going to say we'll talk about more about how Christ's birth got selected as the year of the beginning of our calendar later, because it's just an important thing to know. Yes, but I'm going to use the dates that are in your book as best I can, and know that dates sometimes will change. But this is not a history class, and so a lot of times I will just make it easy and say, for instance, it happened in 500 BC. And it may have happened in 493 BC. That doesn't matter to me. That's a history thing. In your history class, whatever your history professor, I'm going to say that Caesar, for instance, was killed in 35 AD. Your professor in your history class may be 38 AD. I mean BC. That's BC. Both those BC. 38 BC. If you're taking your history test, answer the history test the way your history test teacher taught you. I'm going to say 35 BC is close enough. Yes, for this class. All right. So there's dates. Western bias. One of the things about this class is that it has a very Western bias, and by that I mean it's a survey course, and from now to the end of the course, we're going to talk about theater through the lens of Western Europeans. Was there theater in China? Absolutely. Was there theater in Russia? Absolutely. We're going to speak about it in one day. Was there theater in Africa? Absolutely. We have an entire class on theater and African history. Do we speak about African theater? Not a day. Yes? So know that there's theater outside of the lineage that we're going to talk about, but the reason we use this lens is because I can draw a direct line from the theater of today back through the years to 2500 BC and the theater of Aristotle. Yes? And so that's why I use that lens in a survey course. It seems like the most direct way to get the information to you, but know that I know that there are other sources for theater, other fonts that exist out there. Cool? Now, before we get into reading plays, here's 5 ways that I'm going to say you can judge a good play. They're in your book, if you've read the preview or the prologue. First of all, a play should be complete and self-contained. Now, what does that mean? Well, all the information you need to know what's going on in the play should be in the play. Now, we haven't read Oedipus yet. When you read Oedipus, Oedipus is lacking in that particular area. There's a lot of things about Oedipus that the author of Oedipus thought the audience in Greece would know, and they probably did. But we're not from Greece, or at least most of us aren't, you may be. But even then, you may not know the entire Greek myth. And so the play itself is lacking in being complete and self-contained, yes? But a good plays tend to have that principle. Second thing is it should be internally consistent. Whatever the rules you set up in the play should be the rules of the play. So for instance, I don't know if you've ever seen Pocahontas, the movie Pocahontas. For whatever reason, Pocahontas is the only Disney film where birds sound like birds and raccoons sound like raccoons, but they don't speak English. If you've ever seen Finding Nemo, for some reason, the turtles talk like they're from California. Cowabunga, dude. But whatever you set up the parameters to be, as long as you follow those parameters, that fish can talk, or that birds can't, or that people can see ghosts, or whatever the rule is, that's the rule. It doesn't have to be in life as long as it's internally consistent in the play, yes? And plays are about life, but they are not life. They're fictitious, yes? Third thing is that they should be organized to arouse a specific response. In other words, you should be able to tell whether the play is meant to be funny, or tragic, or in some cases melodramatic. Melodrama is something that's temporarily serious, like I hope COVID-19 is temporarily serious, but I hope someday to be past it so that we can make jokes about it, because right now it seems a little early, as Cody is telling me. So anyway, you should be able to tell if it's serious or comic or in between. Fourth thing is it should have unity. Anything that's involved in the play or anything in the play should have some sort of something about to be there for a reason. If there's one of the things Hitchcock used to talk about was this thing called a red herring. He notoriously would put in something in the play, somebody having a gun or somebody wearing a scarf or something that you thought, because it's a mystery, you've got, that's the person that did it because they're wearing a red scarf, or ooh, that's the person that did it because they had a gun on their back, in their backpack, whatever. Ultimately, it winds up being a red herring because he's trying to trick you. In that case, even that being a disunity is a unity because he's trying to make you miss the real reasons why things happen. But anything in a play, you shouldn't just have arbitrary people coming in and saying things and then leaving and have nothing to do with the play. Yes? Now, on the opposite side, there should be some variety. If the play, for instance, Home Alone is one of my favorite movies. In Home Alone, he's left home alone, imagine that. And you have the burglars trying to come in and he burns their hands and he shoots them with arrows and he has paint cans crush their teeth out and he's have people step on nails on the stairs, oh my God. Anyway, all these crazy funny things happen, and then you flip to Paris where they're standing at the airport trying to get tickets back to find Kevin. There is nothing funny that happens in Paris. But it's a form of variety so that you can, as an audience, catch your breath. So you can relax and go, man, this is funny. So you can stop laughing for a second so that when you go back to Kevin, you can start laughing at these idiots burning their scalps off and all that sort of stuff again until the family finally arrives. So that's what I mean by variety. In Hamlet, when we get to Hamlet, there's a scene with a gravedigger. And again, it's just like the orange Tic Tac we talked about the other day. It's not gonna sound funny out of context, but when Hamlet comes upon this gravedigger, he asks the gravedigger whose grave it is, and the gravedigger says, it's my grave, because he's digging it. Again, I'm not saying it's hysterical, but in the context of Hamlet, it's side-splitting. And so he has about a 5-minute conversation with this gravedigger, and then suddenly you find out that the grave is for his fiance, his love of his life, who's being buried in it because she's killed herself, she's drowned in a pond. And then it becomes very serious again, yes? But at least it's a moment of laughter, of levity within the confines of the play. Now, again with Oedipus, I'm going to fault Oedipus for not having a lot of variety. There is nothing funny in Oedipus. It's a very serious play, and then it gets very serious, and then it gets serious, and then people poke their eyes out and hang themselves, and then it gets serious. So there's not a lot of variety in Oedipus. You go from serious to serious to serious, yes? But good plays tend to have those 5 principles, yes? Again, a starting point for us to talk about plays once we get into plays next class period, yes? Now, all societies, we talked about how they all have examples of theater of some point. Societies that have sent examples down through history, one of the reasons they didn't catch on or at least maintain, well, there's a variety of reasons. For instance, in Egypt, there's certainly evidence of theatrical performance. Robes that people had to wear, ceremonies they had to perform, scripts they had to read from. but it tended to be the priests, which again, in Greece, it was also the priests. But because people outside of Egypt didn't necessarily know how to read or speak hieroglyphics, it was lost to history until really we found the Rosetta Stone, when suddenly we could go back and start reading and translating Egyptian, yes? And so even though the Egyptians knew and talked about what they understood, the rest of society had really no clue, and it wasn't able to be passed down through the centuries. Again, the Babylonian Empire, which began about 2300 BC, lasted until the 6th century when Persia took over or conquered them. They're drawing their little reliefs. For instance, the little relief that I've given you here, where it looks like the king is standing there, and it looks like people are performing in front of him. That could be what's happening. It could be that their servants have feeding them food. I don't know. There's nothing that says, and because we lost how to read Sanskrit, we don't know. But they're at least on a lot of pots and potteries and walls. They're paintings of things that look theatrical to us. And again, once we determine how to translate all these languages, we may find scripts, but they weren't handed down from generation to generation. So even if the theater did exist, it was lost to time. Yes? The Persians certainly had theater. The Persian Empire started around the 6th century. We'll talk a little bit more about the Persians when we begin with the Greeks here in a second. But there are still ceremonies today where you have these circles, much like, I'm going to say, have you ever seen Dancing with Wolves, where they're all standing in a circle dancing for ceremonies? The same type of traditions that happen in Persia with their celebrations to the gods. The society that predates the Greeks, who had the closest impact in future generations, will be the Etruscans. The Etruscans were basically in Tuscany, which is in northern Italy. This isn't really a theater video, but it at least is a video that shows you the type of investigation that investigators go through. It's a Travel Channel video, but you'll get the gist of it here in a second, so just watch this for a second.
Setting off from the great civilized cities of the East like Athens and Tyre, adventurous Greek traders sailed west into uncharted seas. Navigating by the stars, without instruments, they began to explore a remote and little-known peninsula of the Western Mediterranean. They called it Hesperia, the land of the evening sun.
Well, in the 8th century BC, time of westward expansion, Phoenicians going west, Greeks going west, founding colonies. Well, when the Greeks sailed into Italy, they found something they didn't expect. An advanced civilization already there.
Here in the hills of Tuscany, there were already walled cities. There were kings and high priests. There were skillful craftsmen who created a tender and sensuous art like no other in the Mediterranean. And there were traders ready to barter the finest gold and ironwork the ancient world had ever seen. Before Rome, there were the Etruscans. They taught the Romans everything, but left no written records.
Incredible. The Etruscans were some of the most amazing artisans that the West has ever seen. They worked in metal for sculpture. They worked in terracotta and life-size statues with these amazing, inviting expressions. Very warm. They're not cold and distant, but they're people that you want to meet.
The Etruscans lived in the fertile hills of Tuscany. But their real wealth lay underground, the richest deposits of iron ore, copper, and tin in the central Mediterranean. As early as 700 BC, they created shafts, tunnels, subterranean galleries, smelters and slag heaps so vast that 2,500 years later, Mussolini reprocessed them to produce weapons for World War II. Etruscans traded their metalwork as far afield as Syria, Portugal, and even Sweden. But above all, the Etruscans were famous for their open displays of affection between men and women. It shocked the ancient world.
The Greeks, who knew the Etruscans from very early on, before Rome was anything, before Rome was, saw that the Etruscan people gave a position to women that the Greeks certainly wouldn't. Not only were women part of the entire house, women reclined at banquets with men, which for a Greek was absolutely unthinkable.
The change began with the Romans, who grew up in their shadow. The first Romans were primitive, tough backwoodsmen. They resented the Etruscans, but had everything to learn from them, including the darker sides of civilization. Like all ancient people, the Etruscans were rigidly divided by class. Brutal rituals enforced the power and prestige of the nobility. Etruscans staged games at the funerals of important men. The losers were killed. Their blood celebrated the prestige of the dead man and was an offering to his spirit. The wrestlers were slaves captured in warfare. Their lives were worth nothing. Only their deaths were significant. The practice of human sacrifice was common in the ancient world. The Etruscans were no exception. The blood of slaves and captives watered the ground at state rituals throughout the Mediterranean. Romans inherited the Etruscan taste for sacrificial blood. Gladiatorial combat was the Roman equivalent of these gory celebrations of power. Rome took everything from the Etruscans. Etruscan engineers showed them how to drain the marshes where Rome now stands and channel the water into underground sewers. Etruscan architects and builders laid out the Roman Forum as a public square in the 7th century BC. Though Romans owed everything to the Etruscans, they would one day turn on them, crush their beautiful cities, and defame their memory. It would be the first step on Rome's path to empire.
So you can tell from the cave drawings the type of ceremonies that were performed, the festivals that were held for their burial, but also there are other places where you can find festivals being held in celebration of their gods, in celebration of the harvest and all that sort of stuff. So these people are called the Etruscan dancers, and they may well have formed some of Rome's theater when it eventually took off in the 3rd century BC. But there's no direct evidence of those plays having been written or being passed down. So they may have just been music, that sort of thing. Certainly the people that we're going to start with, the Greeks, Greek society. To begin with, in Greek, first of all, Greece is highly segmented in the sense that there are a whole bunch of peninsulas. It basically looks like a hand reaching down into the Mediterranean, and each peninsula is dominated by a city. They call them polis, P-O-L-I-S. So for instance, Sparta is on one of the peninsulas, Athens is on one, Delphi is on one. Each city has the dominance of one of the fingers, basically, of Greece. As a society around 1600, they started coming together. By the 1200s, they had met the Persians, or at least people who lived in the Ionian Peninsula, which is Turkey, with the Trojan War, which happened around 1200 BC. Again, your historian will tell you a specific date. But the Trojan War is the war where you have the Greek soldiers invade inside of the horse that's been given as a gift as they leave the bay. Again, if you've ever read the Iliad is a history, a verbal history of the Trojan War that was passed down by a poet called Homer. There are two, Homer was a blind seer. He was somebody who would stand on the street corner and tell the stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Odyssey is the story of Odysseus trying to return from the Trojan War. Again, historians will tell you that there are certain facts that are probably true. There's debate about whether the horse was an actual horse or not. But there are also actions in the play. For instance, in the Iliad, you have the gods, literally Apollo, standing on top of his temple, throwing spears and killing the Trojans. And so the gods participated in the war. You also have the story of Achilles, who was a real man, and we'll talk more about him later. But there are some things that probably were based on fact, but also there's certainly some exaggerations, some hyperbole that's a part of their drama. Hesiod is the other poet from this period of time. But there is this tradition in Greek society of valuing stories, valuing tales, and handing them down from generation to generation. Now let's talk a little bit about the Greek gods. First of all, again, these are the Greek beliefs. I'm not saying these are accurate or not accurate. I'm just saying this is the history of the Greek gods. There are 12 gods that live on Mount Olympus. Mount Olympus is a real mountain in Greece. It's the tallest mountain in Greece. And because it was typically cloud covered, in other words, there was typically a ring of snow up there and there was typically a ring of clouds up there, it became a place where the men did not venture, but gods lived. Zeus was the lead god, head god. And there were 11 other gods that lived there. Some were women, some were men. There was also a 13th god, Hades, who lived below the surface of the earth. And I would point out that there are also 13 lunar cycles in a year. Now, we have 12 months in our calendar, but one of those months is going to have 2 moons. Yes, the second full moon in a month is called a blue moon, whenever it happens. So there are 13 lunar cycles in a year from the time it takes the Earth to get from one point around the sun back to that same point. And so I'm going to say each month of the year was celebrated by each of the 12 Greek gods. Yes? Now, Dionysus is the Greek god of spring. Now, the first day of spring, in other words, the vernal equinox, the day when there's 12 hours of sun and 12 hours of night, in one day is the vernal equinox, is the first day of spring, and that's March 20th, 21st, and that's why we have leap day, because it really takes the Earth 365 and a quarter days to get around the sun. And so every 4 years we have to add a day in order to keep March 20th, 21st as the first day of spring. That is Dionysus Day. And so every year, from time immemorial, the Greeks would meet at this city called Dionysus, named after him, Dionysia, and they would have a celebration to the god Dionysus. Dionysia is right on the backside. Athens is technically, the city of Athens is technically where the Acropolis is, which is on top of a hill. It's a naturally defensible position because you don't have to build walls because the thing is on top of a huge mountain. On the backside of that mountain is where the city of Dionysia is. And so people from Sparta, from Delphi, from these other Greek polis would travel every spring to Dionysia to celebrate the god Dionysus. And it would initially, again, you're talking about 600 BC, initially it was just the priests from each city of the god Dionysus. Yes? And eventually they started having ceremonies, celebrations, and again, these typically were in the nude. Ladies, you're not invited, just like the Olympics, the Greeks, no way you're involved. And so this is just the priests that would sit around having a celebration to the god Dionysus. And that is where the traditions of theater begin that will be passed down to the world today. And we'll talk more about that next class period. See you later.